Welcome to Opinion Duel from the Purple Network. I'm Christina Bellantoni, Editor-in-Chief of Roll Call, and I'm here with Zoe Carpenter of The Nation and Charles Cook of the National Review. And today we're discussing the minimum wage. Would raising it lift millions out of poverty, or is it really a job destroyer? This is the frame for the debate. Zoe Carpenter of The Nation, where does this stand right now, right? There's legislation on Capitol Hill that's pending, but is the minimum wage ever going to go up?
I think there's a lot of momentum for it, especially if you look at polling. It is popular across the country, in all regions, across the political spectrum. So even Republicans in the South want the minimum wage to be at $10.10. I think there's an argument to be made that that's going to be too low over the long run. We're still seeing wages stay stagnant compared to productivity, and that's something that we should be concerned about over the long run. But I think this is a great first step, certainly, in trying to bridge that gap.
Charles Cook?
It is popular. Until you say, and do you still support this if it damages the economy and if it costs jobs, at which point the support goes down to around 30%. Now, the question therefore is, does it cost jobs? Now, Economics 101 would suggest that it does cost jobs. There is a real debate over this. It does irritate me slightly when both sides say, no, we're right. No one is quite sure. If there was a huge review of the literature recently that suggested that it does cost jobs, but at the same time, I'm willing to listen to people who say that it doesn't. But it is worth saying that you phrase the question as lifting people out of poverty. Most people on the minimum wage are not below the poverty line. They're actually middle class people. And most people who benefit from the minimum wage don't benefit from it for a very long time. So, when you're looking at how you can help people who are actually in need, it is often the case that the minimum wage is not what it is sold as, and is also not the best way to do it.
And you've seen in states, it's different rates everywhere, right? And some people are paying way more than that already.
Very few states are paying way more than $10.10 an hour.
Way more than the national average.
Way more, meaning $1 or $2 more still. That's really hard to live on. And I think when you look at who this would help, just because you're not below the poverty line doesn't mean that you're middle class. Most of the people who would be helped are within 3 times the poverty line. That's still lower middle income, even if you're at 3 times the poverty level for a family. And these are adults largely that would be helped. Mostly women, or majority women, and these are people who are working more than 20 hours a week. It's not teenagers working part-time, and it's true that it's not sufficient for lifting all of the Americans who are in poverty out of poverty or helping to rebuild the middle class, but it's certainly a place to start, and there isn't really other legislation on the table right now that could have these kinds of effects.
Look, economically, the question of whether people can live on what they're being paid, it's politically important, it's not economically important. The fact is that someone's labor is worth what someone's labor is worth. So the question for a government is, can we forcibly change what that person has to be paid without making such a gap between what their labor is worth to the employer and what we've set it at, that they'll be fired or not employed in the first place. Now, conservatives much prefer the earned income tax credit, which garnishes the wage, does the opposite. It burnishes the wages of low-income Americans who have jobs. But Obama is never going to get that through, which is why he's going for the minimum wage. And it's probably worth just stepping back a little bit and working out why we're here. We're here because the federal government is hugely in debt. We're here because Americans have, for now at least, lost their enthusiasm for taxing and spending and don't want another big program. We're here because the stimulus is viewed with suspicion. So it's much easier for a president to say, well, we're not going to deal with this through the government. We're going to force private employers to pay people more. The question is that a good idea in this economy? And my answer would be no, it's absolutely not a good idea in this economy. If you actually want to do something, you should look at something like the earned income tax credit. If you're not going to do that, that doesn't mean that we should automatically do the minimum wage, right?
So I think we're here for very different reasons, and I agree with you that the earned income tax credit is really effective and it's a great program. However, when conservatives talk about the EITC, I haven't really heard any conservatives putting forward a policy that actually expands the program. So you have someone like Marco Rubio who talks about an EITC type program, and really what he's talking about doing is spreading around the money that's already in the EITC, which would take money away from families and give them to single adults. So I agree we need to expand the program to cover more childless adults. However, to do that, you have to spend money. And I don't see any conservatives lining up to say, yes, let's spend more money on the ITC. And to go back to why we're here, why the wages haven't kept up with productivity, we've had the weakening of labor unions purposefully undermined. We have a jobs crisis, and so workers have no bargaining power. That depresses wages. When there are so many workers looking for jobs, companies don't have any incentive to have higher wages because you can just fire someone who's striking or asking for higher wages. And so, this is something that I think you can look at the stimulus and say it wasn't big enough, and that's partly why we have so few jobs now and why we have this pressure pushing wages down.
And of course, in a midterm election year, as is everything, it's part of the frame of this. One thing that was uncovered out of the Clinton archives recently was the Clintons saying that actually not raising the minimum wage was more beneficial to Democrats because they could then go ahead and continue to press Republicans on the issue and campaign. And you're seeing that exact same thing play out this year.
There's no doubt that this is an electoral boon for Democrats to be able to tell Republicans to raise the minimum wage. And Zoe is spot on. It is popular. The second question really matters, but it rarely gets asked, and it's rarely going to make it into the debate. So yeah, I'm in favor of raising the minimum wage, says the Democrat. I'm not, says the Republican. Or Republicans pretend that it's perfect where it is rather than saying we should get rid of it completely. But I would say, why do Republicans not have a plan on this other than their dislike of the minimum wage as a tool? Well, it's partly because there has been so much spending that they're throwing their hands up and saying we can't keep adding programs. We've already made certain choices. The earned income tax credit, if you look, for example, in the New York Times in the 1980s, they were against the minimum wage being raised. There was a famous editorial when they said that all this will do is destroy jobs. And instead of doing that, they said we need to expand the earned income tax credit and we need to give subsidies for healthcare. Now that's precisely what we've done over almost 30 years. Frequent rises in the earned income tax credit, frequent expansions, and now Obamacare gives subsidies. And still we're told, no, but now we need a minimum wage rise as well. And I think conservatives are saying, we don't have any money left, we're not going to do all of these things at the same time, make your choices.
Well, so yes, we should be making choices, and we're spending money on things we don't need to spend it on. We're throwing money at the Pentagon, money that the Pentagon doesn't want. We've talked about the tax loopholes, and the deficits are falling, and I think economists broadly agree that we have to get over this deficit hysteria, and that to spur economic growth, we have to spend money. We have to have some sort of something to pick up demand, because without demand, there's no expectation that the free market can just solve the problem. It's just not going to happen. And so, this is something that we can we're not spending money on. We're not increasing the deficit by raising the minimum wage. That's asking private employers
I
to
agree.
do something.
But you asked why there was no EITC plan, for example, from conservatives, and that is the government spending money. Now, the choice that you just presented is a very progressive way of presenting it. It says, let's look between social welfare and defense spending. Now, I think there could be modest cuts to defense spending. I'm sure you would think they would be much larger than me, but that's not really the choice that we're making. The reason that we have runaway debt is because we haven't paid for entitlements for the elderly. We haven't paid for Social Security or Medicare, and we don't ever cut them, partly because older people are such a large constituency. Now, that is fine if that's the choice that we want to make, but what we're saying then is no, we're not going to cut healthcare, and we're not going to cut Social Security, and we're going to add this huge new entitlement on the top of it. And the result of that will be that people at the bottom end of the income ladder are going to suffer because we can't afford other things. That's fine to make that, but we can't just pretend that we can afford everything and then cry foul when conservatives say, could we stop?
The reason we have so much debt is because we launched 2 misguided, long-term, and failed wars in the Middle East. That's why we have so much debt, not because we're paying for people's health insurance.
What would the debt be without the wars?
It would be much lower. It would be much lower. And what's the pressure? Obviously balanced budgets eventually in the long term are important, but if we're talking about the next decade and trying to get the economy back on its feet, cutting, we know, the IMF, IMF is not a progressive institution by reputation. The IMF and the World Bank, all of these institutions have come out and said austerity has not been a solution. It has made things worse. And I think that if we continue to latch on to that idea that what's most important is balancing our budget in the short term, we're going to continue to have a recession.
There's an awful lot of space between austerity and balancing a budget and where we are now. And I'm suggesting that adding another government program such as the EITC is not the best idea. Now, not adding another program doesn't take us to austerity. There's no retrenchment in that. It's just not adding more and more and more to the federal budget. We already make choices. We're paying for food stamps. There's huge expansion. You can argue for that.
Significantly cut this year through the Farm Bill.
Well, not significantly cut, no. Cut around the edges over 10 years by what, 4% was it? And people went crazy over this. As I
If
say,
you're
Social
hungry
Security-
and you're going to bed without dinner,
Sure.
that percentage is
so
pretty
then
large.
make that argument, but we can't have everything, and so you have to decide what is more important. As I say, the president wants a minimum wage rise because he doesn't have to make a tough decision, but the minimum wage, in my view, and in the view of a lot of economists, doesn't work. So what we're settling for is, well, because we can't do what actually does work, we'll do something that doesn't work in order to placate people who like it. And that's crazy.
Those are complements. I mean, the minimum wage and the EITC aren't opposing policies. Progressive economists are very clear that those two things work together. And, in terms of the impact of the minimum wage, which I think we could circle back to, the benefits are much likely to outweigh the costs in terms of job loss. And yes, there may be trade-offs. Maybe some people lose their jobs. And I think we do have to ask that question is where should that trade-off be? And it's something that we can do that doesn't. If you're worried about the deficit, it is a policy that we can use. And most of the research suggests that it will have minimal effects on employment while having a massive effect in
But you're
terms
begging
of
the question
raising
now
standard.
because you're presuming that it works, and I'm saying that's
It
a
has
point
worked
of contention.
in empirical studies, and when you look at states that have raised the minimum wage, it has not cost jobs.
In some studies it has worked, and in other studies it hasn't. This is a matter of great dispute.
That's
and where
true.
does the business industry stand on this? Because you've seen some private employers raise wages on their own. You've seen the president take matters into his own hands and raise it for federal contractors. So where does that all play into these studies? It's not just studies, it's actual in practice, right?
Well, those are two different things, of course. Business raising it is a business choice. Now, they may decide that their being able to employ fewer people is worth the PR that they get from it. They may have enough reserves to make it worthwhile. They may be able to cut the pay of their CEO or raise their prices to accommodate it. I don't know. That's for an individual business to decide. I don't run those businesses. I don't have any interest or shares in those businesses, so I don't particularly care what private business does, in the same way I don't care how individuals choose to live their lives. The federal government changing it through executive fiat, that is a separate question, because what you're doing there is you're saying, well, any contracts that are entered into are now going to have to pay people more money, and that we are therefore eventually going to have to go to Congress and say we need more tax revenue because we run out of money faster. So that does make a difference. On the other hand, I mean, with the federal announcement that Obama made, let's be honest, it was weak sauce. It affected
a
so
small
few
number of
people
people.
that it's for show.
Right. The business community has always opposed minimum wage increases and always cried out that it's going to hurt the economy, and we haven't seen that come to pass in past minimum wage increases. The wages are so far behind productivity. Most of the corporations who are behind opposition to the minimum wage have huge disparities between what their top executive makes and what they're actually paying their workers. And it seems a little silly for them to say they can't afford to pay their workers. You have someone like the McDonald's CEO who's making billions of dollars a year, or millions of dollars a year. And his workers have to rely on food stamps, they have to rely on housing assistance, increasing the deficit. And so, if you think about picking up the wages for those people who are relying on the programs that you're worried about being too costly, that could help the long-term budget.
Once again, if I assume you're right, then you're right. But you are presuming that the minimum wage does what you say it does. Now, if you go back, for example, and Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell did an awful lot of work on this, both extremely well-respected economists and academics, and looked at what the minimum wage did to, say, black youth unemployment from the mid-1930s onwards, and concluded that it should have been called the Anti-Negro Bill, and that's the exact words of Milton Friedman, because it effectively destroyed the chances of young and uneducated people to get into a position where they could be trained and therefore make their labor worth more money. Now, the CBO suggested that there were about 500,000 people who would either lose their jobs or not be employed if a minimum wage increase to 1010 was put forth by Congress.
Because people would lay people off?
Right, because, and this is such a harsh thing to say, but this is basic economics. If I am only worth, say, $6 to my employer, he might just about pay me $7.65, but he can't bridge that gap between, say, $6 and $10.10, and so he lays you off, right? Now, the CBO said, and this is an impartial study, they might be wrong, but it's an impartial study, that there will be 500,000 of these people. It is worth remembering those are the weakest people. By definition, those are the people whose labor is worth the least, because if it weren't, they wouldn't be the ones being laid off. So if you want to argue, presuming they're right, that it's worth it to give a minor increase to the rest of the people on the minimum wage, so be it. But again, these are trade-offs.
Right, and I agree that there may be trade-offs. The CBO report was a meta-analysis, as I'm sure you know, of looking at a bunch of different studies, and it weighted certain studies in different ways. So it's fair to ask whether it weighted evidence in a way that actually reflects past experience and past history with the minimum wage. But most of the economists who responded to the CBO report deemed it very a conservative estimate, meaning conservative as in that 500,000 number is a very large, perhaps overestimation of the number of people who would lose their jobs compared to the 900,000 people who would be lifted out of poverty and the others who would benefit, who would have wage increases above the poverty line.
We're going to have to leave it there for today. Another interesting debate from Opinion Duel, the Purple Network. Thank you.